Okay, on to our last time machine port of call, Japan. The main thing I remember learning about Japan back in the Triassic era when I attended high school was that American Naval Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo, that is, Tokyo, harbor in 1853, pointed his guns at the Japanese shore, and forced a closed kingdom to open itself up to global trade and influence. This left me at the time with the impression, which I can't really blame on my history teacher, that Japan had been entirely closed off before the American Navy sailed in. But that's a little hard to reconcile with emissaries showing up from all over Asia to celebrate the opening of Japan's enormous Todaiji Hall in 752, or a Korean artist designing the Great Buddha. By the way, the highly symmetrical pagoda design of this temple showed its strong Chinese influence. Japanese architecture was traditionally more intimate. It was also more organic and symmetrical, closely associated with its natural surroundings. This was a building designed to show off, especially to the Tang Dynasty Chinese. This beautiful temple is not one of your required works, but I wanted you to see what is in many ways a more typical Japanese Buddhist temple complex. Phoenix Hall is probably the most famous temple to Pure Land Buddhism, a version of Buddhism that promises its followers salvation in a Western paradise if they follow the teachings of the Amitabha Buddha. It's not hard to see how the whole structure was designed to create an image of a celestial paradise. Two bronze phoenixes that decorate the end of the ridgepoles and gave the temple its names were said to alight on kingdoms that were properly ruled. So here again we see Buddhism used by the imperial family to encourage unity and support for the regime. Whom did the phoenix symbolize in Chinese iconography? Anyone remember? The Empress, or the Yin force. And do you remember that weird 1998 work on the bottom? It's a vision of the Pure Land paradise as well, complete with anime elves. But note again that the Phoenix Temple is more asymmetrical and is related organically to its surroundings. This form of Japanese architecture would strongly influence American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. Falling Water will be one of our required works in the spring. When the Tang Dynasty and China started disintegrating, Japan terminated relations with China in 894 and did enter into a period of isolation. The imperial court moved to Kyoto, and for almost 4 centuries, non-Buddhist Japanese art was mostly the art of a highly cultured, rather decadent imperial court. There are some really remarkable parallels to the French court of Louis XIV, XV, and XVI at Versailles in the 17th and 18th centuries. Stay tuned for Rococo art. This era in Japanese art produced one of the most important works of Japanese, and for that matter, world literature, Tales of a Genji. It's full of intrigue, romance, seduction, and it was actually written by a Japanese noblewoman. This illustration comes from that book, and it was typical of Heian-era court painting. It is not a required work. Instead, our next required work comes from a period when this refined world fell apart. In the late 12th century, Japan disintegrated into civil war, and for the next 600 years it was ruled by a military ruler, the shogun, powerful lords, the daimyo, and their warrior elite, the samurai. During the first part of this military rule, Japan actually maintained close ties to the Asian world and even opened up to Jesuit missionaries and to Portuguese and Dutch traders. In around 1600, however, the Tokugawa dynasty of shoguns would slam that door shut until Commodore Perry pried it open in 1848. But we are getting ahead of our story. This work dates from the first period of warrior rule, the Kamakura period. The upper required image isn't much help, is it? That's because the work is almost 23 feet long. It tells the story of a relatively minor event in Japanese history, a brief armed skirmish between 2 competing factions for control of the capital, which at the time was still Kyoto. The hand scroll was painted 100 years after the events took place, and, for what it's worth, the faction that won this battle lost out in the long run. Basically, as the scroll unfolds, one group of warriors surrounds the palace, captures the sovereign, places him in a cart, and then consigns the structure to the flames. Although this image is not the scene that the College Board chose as a required image, it's probably the most iconic scene of the scroll. The palace on fire, the sky filled with swirling lines and bright colors. The website I've listed here lets you move through the entire scroll, from right to left, of course, with explanations. You can zoom in and out and focus on the details. It's a lot of fun, and it's up on Moodle. If you have time, and if Adobe Flash Player works, you might look at a little of it in class. The night attack at Sanjo Palace is a very important example of what is called Yamato-e painting, a style of painting that was distinctively Japanese with much less Chinese influence. During the shogunate, Yamato-e paintings mostly superseded the elegant courtly paintings of the earlier period, and they suited the warrior culture that produced and admired these works. Do not try to write all this down. I'm going to run through the scroll quickly and then come back to these elements of style with illustrations from the scroll. So here is the emperor's cart. And now the same cart is being surrounded by warriors. The scroll, like the Bayeux Tapestry, like Trajan's column, uses the device of continuous narration to tell the complicated story of a battle. The repeated images, such as the cart, help us find where we are in the narrative and establish a pattern and rhythm to the work. Here we see the attackers approach the palace, the captured emperor in tow. They storm the palace. They set the palace on fire. The ladies of the court are crushed or burned, pretty gruesome there. The battle continues outside the city walls. And here in our required image, a lone archer escapes from the burning palace with an equestrian Japanese commander behind him. So now let's go back to that laundry list of Yamato-e paintings and look for the features in our required work. Note here that while the soldier is not carefully delineated, his armor and his weapons are. This tells you something about what the patrons of this work cared about, and it's another work that military historians still love to study. You should see also the diagonal lines, the depersonalized figures. And here are some of the other characteristics of Yamato-e painting. The bird's eye perspective, the bold colors and defined contours, contour lines, and the shallow spaces that are combined with the use of overlapping to create some sense of depth. Before I leave the samurai, let me show one more narrative painting. This one is a 6-panel scroll made of ink-painted silk, and it shows the great battle that established the Tokugawa shogunate in around 1600. This was the military leadership that would once again close Japan to the world. The painting actually tells you one of the reasons the Tokugawa clan won the battle. Can you guess? Hard to see, isn't it? Maybe this close-up will help. Basically, the guys with those newfangled guns, which they purchased from the Portuguese, beat the samurai with swords. I'm going to break here. In my final lecture, I will return to Japan and explore more recent works.